Hello, I would like to provide a short introduction for the following video. This video compiles information over the past year and centers around the topic of food shortages. This topic is explored in its physical ramifications as well as its spiritual ones. I trust that you will derive value from it and be able to see meaning in the video in its entirety.
The huge vortices of energy created by our technologies present us with unfathomable consequences. Put a decent man in an aeroplane a few hundred feet above a village, and he will kill without compunction, inflict appalling pain and injury on men, women, and children. That bomber pilot is really very much like the person introducing any new technology. None of these people ever consider what will be the impact or the effect of what they do when they pull that trigger. We cannot trust our instincts or our natural physical responses to new things. They will destroy us. How are we to get out of the maelstrom created by your own ingenuity? Edgar Allan Poe has a story called The Descent into the Maelstrom. Poe imagines the situation in which a sailor who has gone up on a fishing boat.
The heaving sea swallowed my brother, and I was swept into the chaos of the maelstrom. I could only await my eventual plunge into the abyss. With all hope lost, I found myself idly studying the action of the vortex. Some objects did not fall, but were whirled up to the level of the sea. Therein lay my salvation. I tied myself to an old steamer trunk, and I abandoned my doomed ship. Thus did I free myself from oblivion.
Or if you have a thought on that at all.
I mean, my framing, if people are following me, is that it's not about this single incident. Whatever what is happening now, this reset tied to the fourth industrial revolution coming out of the World Economic Forum, I feel like it's useful to understand, like the understanding of virology and the way in which it's being weaponized to create a global biosecurity state is valuable. I think I would prefer people, rather than getting lost in the very specifics of this particular health event at this stage of the game, to spend their time understanding these larger intersections. Like, I mean, clearly Fauci and the NIH are connected to the Gates money. There are other things going on there, and there's a lot of fluidity. I mean, I think ultimately there is a great deal of fluidity between China, between global finance, the Bay Area, who's influencing whom. You know, it's hard to say. So I feel like we have this movement towards an industrially engineered society, where maybe some basic mechanisms of life are offered to conditionally to people. And then we have, something that's chaotic. I think we clearly realize that whatever is coming next is probably going to be chaotic.
morning, everybody. This is Mike with On Point Preparedness. Haven't done a live stream this early before, but I wanted to get this out because I got a really busy weekend. This is going to be a Sign of the Times update, building on some other warnings that I had shared in the past regarding China and the revolt/rebellion that's brewing there, as well as global food shortages. The two actually are tied hand in hand. If you recall, China has a zero policy regarding the pandemic, and so they're shutting down major cities. Jinlin was one. Right now it's Shanghai. And in Shanghai, this zero policy means that even like essential grocery stores are shut down. People have to get their food delivered. And if you know how many people, there's like millions upon millions of people that are under this lockdown. And when you try to do that and say everyone has to have their groceries delivered, there's naturally going to be shortages. And now people are legitimately starving in their homes, and there is full-on revolt going on in the cities. So again, in terms of Sign of the Times and this global rebellion that I've been speaking of, China is definitely on the radar. And not just in Shanghai or Jinlin or some of these other major cities. You know, people across China are paying attention. And as we've seen in prior years, whenever they start to hear about these lockdowns, they were preemptively starting to prepare and panic buy and get lots of grains and sacks of wheat and things like that from the stores. Again, that was reactive when they were starting to hear these lockdowns. Now that they're seeing it more and more frequently, I'm sure that there's going to be a push more and more across all of China to stock up proactively instead of reactively. So I want to show you a whole bunch of footage coming out of Shanghai. There's also food riots that are happening in Peru. There's food riots happening in Sri Lanka. And overall, the big message here is that, yes, food riots have begun. Not here yet in the United States or some of the other first world Western countries, but you have to think about the progression here. Inflation prices are continuing to creep up, and the food riots happen when your lowest income level of people are boxed out of food. That's the only threshold you need to go over. And so what we're seeing start right now is that your poorer countries are starting to engage in food riots because there is a tiered system in terms of wealthiest countries to the most impoverished countries. But then what we will start to see is in the better off countries, as there's various classes of people, then we'll start to see it in the Western nations when we have the poorer population start to get boxed out of food. And we pretty much are starting to see that. We're starting to see bread lines increase across the United States, and it's not hidden. It's all mainstream media news that's starting to cover these things. And so I find it very interesting that there's a lot of people that I know personally that are not preppers, that are not into Bible prophecy, none of these things. And I'm starting to hear whispers of people saying, you better stock up. People are talking, because Biden talked about the food shortages, Justin Trudeau talked about the food shortages. It's not hidden anymore. And so really the threshold that people have to go over in order to really start preparing for this is all about that psychological principle of dealing with grief or denial. People are seeing it on the news right now, but a lot of people are still in denial. But then there's going to be a time when people see enough signs that there's going to be an acceptance period, and they'll say, okay, we really need to start doing something. And so I think we're in the midst of this. I don't know what the timings are. There's all these projections of people saying the summertime we're going to see food riots here in the US or Canada or whatnot. Some people are saying the end of 2022. Some people are saying next year. We have no idea. I think one of the overall wild card is that we have these situations popping up left and right that no one ever really expected. And so a lot of these timelines are based on the current status of things. But who knows what the next thing is going to bring, which puts a wrench in everything. So again, prepare in faith according to what the Lord convicts you of. And let's get on over here to some of the little screenshots and clips that I have to share with you. I got another one here where they are all entering into Shanghai. Well, here's another one. I got a fourth one before I jump into a different topic on what's going on in China. So here you have police officers, obviously in the pandemic uniforms, and again, they're armed. So this is a change, and you have to ask yourself why, right? Like why? This all seems to be happening, very, very quickly. All these major cities. Shanghai, Jinlin, now Guangzhou. There's some other ones as well. I can't remember the names, but tens of millions of people being locked down in zero COVID policy. It's just something strange is going on. There's some theories that I've heard. Again, it's all speculation. No one really knows. But let me share with you some other things that are happening here. Again, I think that China really is on like a verge of a breaking point here. This happened. I saw some videos of this happening in the very beginning of the pandemic, where you heard people screaming from their hotel rooms because they weren't even allowed to leave their rooms. There were a lot of images of the CCP even putting chains around doors and first floor windows, preventing people from getting out. And again, the very beginning of the pandemic, you had people all screaming out of their windows. And now you're seeing this again in Shanghai, and you're seeing it in other cities as well. And so this commenter says that, let's see here, they've been locked down for about 2 weeks. Again, as I covered in the last video, some are getting food maybe once a week, others less. And so everyone's screaming, we need foods.
半个月了，我们1单元只收到了1次菜，2、3单元收到了2次菜，现在也没有能买菜的地方，所有的人都在喊没有菜吃，然后
It's absolutely terrible. Here's another one at nighttime. So as seen on Weibo, Shanghai residents go to their balconies and sing and protest the lack of supplies. And actually a drone appears and it has a statement, please comply with the restrictions, control your soul's desire for freedom, do not open the window or sing. So here's a little drone up here. I think I have another video. Do I have it here? No, I didn't have it here, but same thing. There's another nighttime video which I don't have the tab pulled up, but it shows all the skyscrapers around Shanghai, and you can just hear people screaming out of their balconies. And again, they're not getting food, and so they're really reaching a breaking point. And as I showed in my morning video today, people are pushing through police barricades and just risking everything because they don't have anything. Again, it makes you wonder, like, why are they being so stringent? Why are they being this hard? Because again, it doesn't really seem, even if you want to control the populace, it doesn't even seem like a very effective strategy, to where you go to the point of even like starving them out, because there's going to be revolt.
Good afternoon, everyone. Wheat spiking, zinc spiking, thermal coal record highs, palm oil futures record high, a quarter of global grains coming from Ukraine and Russia, soybean harvest Paraguay slashed by 60%, Brazil lowering its soybean crop almost 5%, Argentina limiting corn and wheat exports. Wait, Moldova doing the same, wheat, corn. And now you'll understand China running to the world market to buy any commodity at any price. Hungary bans now exports following Moldova. Argentina, global grain stockpiles to drop for a 5th year. Biggest weekly gain on record, wheat, vertical, from $8 to $13.40. Looking at the numbers, Hungary's ban 127,000 tons. Moldova, the stamp center stage of agriculture. Ukrainian wheat exports, these countries, civil unrest starting. Bangladesh, Pakistan, Turkey, Indonesia, and Egypt as the food is cut off. Wheat exports coming in the lowest time of the year, May and June, but we can only use the precedent of what we've seen in history, average 4x increase on these types of situations. Do you think fiat currency based on debt can survive this? And a vast majority applauding the sanctions have not really understood the ramifications for global food shortages, energy shortages, hyperinflation, and unaffordable cost of living, but they're about to live it in 2 months or less, 60 days. We were warned already, Russian invasion of Ukraine would, upset the breadbasket of Europe. And if this persists and continues into the planting season and into June, wheat around the planet will need to be rationed. Your rationing card will be digital this time, not paper like your grandparents. So if you didn't do it for the jab, you're going to do it for food. The global financial crisis, many of you remember, wheat prices soared to the highest since the global financial crisis. A 5.3% rise in anything on the commodities market is stupendous. When you go limit up on commodities, that's huge. These candles straight up stopped trading. It's gone up that high that fast. So what's that going to do with your food budget? Will you even have enough money at the end of each month to cover your food and your electric bill? Oh, and you need to drive your car, so petrol's going to double in price. And China is all over this, looking at what they need to import now because the shortages will ensue during the summer. 7.6% the next day of trading in wheat. Grain trading limit up.
Ladies and gentlemen, I just want to start a conversation about a part of the Ukraine situation I think is dramatically underreported. A lot of people talking about energy prices, and rightly so. The fact that Europe's being cut off from their gas supplies, even as stores they are historically low. Of course, this will affect energy prices. It already is affecting energy prices in the U.S. as well. But as always, here on the Ice Age Farmer channel, I try to shine the light on the effects on our food supply, chiefly because very few people even now are doing that. So right now we need to discuss the fact that Russia and Ukraine are responsible for about 1/3 of the global exports of wheat and other grains, and that those are being summarily cut off from the West right now. In fact, this is obviously a situation that's happening in real time. Those are already being redirected to China, who has only yesterday okayed the import of wheat. To date, they had said, we don't want it, there's a risk that it's got mold on it, would contaminate our supplies, but suddenly it's not that unattractive to President Xi. He's said, we'll go ahead and import your wheat. So overnight, almost overnight, 1/3 of the global wheat supply has been rerouted from Western countries now to China, which of course already had 50%, more than 50% of the world's stocks of wheat and other strategic grains. That is on top of the fact that, as we read here from the International Grain Council, wheat stockpiles are at a 9-year low. And of course, part of what's going on in the Ukraine is that the military has shut all of the ports. That means that those exports, like we said, between Russia and Ukraine, 1/3 of the global grains supply coming out of these major producers and exporters. Literally, these are the breadbaskets of the world that feed many countries that depend on that food. Countries depend on that food or they will starve. And now these Ukrainian ports have been closed. Ukraine, quote, has suspended operations at its ports following Russia's decisions to close the Azov until further notice. Russia and Ukraine, major exporters of wheat and grain, and ports operations have been suspended. That is what led Reuters to report here. Ukraine shuts ports as the conflict threatens global grain supplies. Quote, Ukraine's military has suspended commercial shipping at its ports after Russian forces invaded the country. An advisor to the Ukrainian president's chief of staff said, stoking fear of supply disruption from these leading grain and, like we just said, oilseed exporters.
17% of wheat comes from Russia, 12% from Ukraine. That's from Bank of America. And looking out at the International Grains Council, 102 million tons produced in Russia and Ukraine. That's not going to be remotely close to that figure this year. Along with the oil exports that are cut, which is approximately 7.5% of global oil. So somewhere in the world, we're going to have to find 30% extra grains and another, let's say 10% oil just to break even. I don't see it happening personally. I'd be more prepared and getting prepared because I don't think there's a way out of this.
My friends, welcome. In my previous report, it was still the early hours of the conflict in Ukraine, but already we could see that merchant ships getting hit with vessels and the ports closing was going to be a big problem, to the extent that a third of the world's grain supplies come out of the Black Sea region. Of course, we said, let's keep an eye on this and see how long the situation is going to continue. And unfortunately, in the hours since then, not only have numerous analysts and traders and experts echoed my warnings, but we see that this is not going to be a short-lived thing. In fact, countries are shutting their ports to any Russian-flagged vessels or vessels that have been chartered by Russian companies or even carrying Russian goods. That's, for example, the UK today passed a law to ban all ships with any Russian connection from entering British ports. So that's, even if they completely clear up the conflict in Ukraine overnight, these vessels are not going to be able to reach the UK going forward.
So between this chart here, an enormous amount of global grains being controlled or going offline by certain parties. So we know so far up to this point and through this next month, possibly two, that Russian and Ukrainian wheat are not going to be offered, and country after country is going to follow with export restrictions. That's wheat. Corn is next. And we're coming into the planting season with Ukrainian farming. This month they would be tilling the fields. If it does not go in the ground, we are going to have a famine on this planet. And a nice quote here, Rabobank, we are now learning what it means to eject the world's only full-spectrum commodity superpower from the international financial and trading system. How much would that be, though, in tonnage, do you think? So Russian Federation, or Russia, was poised to come in somewhere around 115 million tons. They dropped their forecast from 127 or 130 million all the way down to 115 million. Knocked in production, which matches up with that 10% loss there. Ukraine, we'll call it 87 million tons. Kazakhstan, an extra 15 or 16 million tons. That's all offline. Kazakhstan production generally goes to China anyway. But look for Belarus to be next, 5.3 million tons. Then we got Hungary and Bulgaria, Moldova, and it just keeps rolling along with the export bans.
There's something else going on here. Let's see here. A lot of the videos I shared with you again this morning was Shanghai, but I do want to show some things about Guangzhou, about the panic buying and the food shortages. So this official notice from the government of Guangzhou says that they guarantee that the city has sufficient supplies of daily necessities with stable prices and called on the citizens not to panic. However, what's happening? Well, here's again some videos from Guangzhou. Let me just rewind that one, and you can see that again everything's being picked over. Some other images here. Fresh vegetable section in another Guangzhou supermarket. There's still some things on the shelves, but it looks like everything fresh is completely gone. Some more images of other grocery stores in the Guangzhou district. And more pictures. It's pretty much all over the city. And it's because, and I'll add some commentary while this one's going, it's because they are now announcing mandatory testing across the entire city. And so as I said in this morning's video, people are talking in China and they see, what's going on. They see what's going on in Shanghai. They hear about their fellow countrymen actually starving in their own buildings. And so sometimes proactively. I'm sure people are running to the stores and getting things, and especially once they're making these mandatory testing requirements, then people definitely are going out to the stores and raiding them, and obviously tensions are very high and there's fighting and things like that. So things seem very, very tense out there.
So again, if it's not one thing, it's another, or it's the shipping container shortages, or it's just stunning the extent to which our supply chains have been disrupted, and it's all a cascading series of failures, and it's coming home to roost real fast now. And wheat, ladies and gentlemen, let us just remind ourselves, wheat is a bellwether historically for famine, for starvation, and when we're seeing a wheat shortage globally, this is a situation we need to pay attention to. China, obviously, like I said before, saw this coming. They were ahead of the game. They were frantically buying up all of the wheat that they could from the United States earlier. This is only in April that this was announced, no, March. And around that time, they were saying, oh, we can't seem to get any more corn or soybeans, so we're going to reformulate our animal feed and start using wheat instead. And they started ravenously buying up all the wheat they could get. I want to step back and ask the question, what purpose does this serve? Who's, right, cui bono, who's benefiting from the supply chains being demolished, the food chain falling apart?
Massive chemical fire at Illinois plant could burn for days, posted June 14th. Look at the devastation. Somebody blew this thing up. Fire chief says, we felt it was in our best interest to just let this product burn off. The plant produces lubricants, grease products, and other fluids, prompting local evacuation. Of course, this will cause an environmental nightmare. You wondered how the green lockdown was going to get kickstarted? Stuff like this. All they need is an excuse and say, things are getting too crazy, there's too much pollution, capitalism is to blame, so let's lock everything down and restart the economy with the Great Reset, starting with green lockdowns. Are you ready for climate lockdowns? What, you think I'm making that up? Avoiding a climate lockdown by the WBCSD, that rolls off the tongue. That stands for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. 3M, Apple, Bloomberg, BMW, Chevron, BP, Dow, DuPont, Google, IBM, IKEA, Kellogg's, Nestle, Procter & Gamble, it just keeps going. This was published way back in October 2020, so it's not even a new thing. They say in the near future, the world may need to resort to lockdowns again, this time to tackle a climate emergency. Wait, how could the climate create an emergency that we need a lockdown to solve? Who cares? They say under a climate lockdown, governments would limit private vehicle use, ban the consumption of red meat, and impose extreme energy-saving measures. Fossil fuel companies would have to stop drilling. To avoid such a scenario, we have to overhaul economics and do capitalism differently. You see, in this article, they explain how the three crises, the health crisis, the economic crisis, and the environmental crisis, are all interconnected by the Anthropocene, which they call a disease. Yes, the disease of the Anthropocene. That's from the U.S. National Library of Medicine and National Institute of Health. What is the Anthropocene? Well, it's humanity. Anthropocene literally means the world as controlled by humanity. So what they're saying is humans are a disease that needs to be wiped out. And here we go again with that green transformation. I've been telling you guys for a long time that the Green Rider from Revelation is about world population reduction. That's the solution. That's what we're seeing now.
My friends, everywhere around the world you look, you see the destruction of our supply chains and our food supply. This is most visually compelling in South Africa, where we've just seen riots that were clearly not organic. These were organized and very professional, targeting the supply chain and the ability of that country to continue operating using logistics and feeding itself. But the same story is playing out in many other places, often more surreptitiously. For example, in Canada, where following the Lytton fire, which destroyed 90% of that town, and perhaps you've read about the tensions between the indigenous people and so on and so forth. It's a different story, a compelling one nonetheless. But what isn't being talked about is the fact that the Canadian train services have been shut down since then because they blamed the rail for that fire. And so in the wake of the fire, they just said, well, we're just going to shut it down. We're going to keep it shut down. It's also pretty striking that the fire support services were not called out there. You can see one fire person here saying, why, they told us to be ready, but they're not calling us out. And there were other people who jumped on that thread and said, yeah, this is really frustrating. Everyone's been told to be ready, but no one's been activated yet. So they let that fire burn. They blamed the train for it. And sure enough, then they shut down train service for the better part of a month now. There's a headline today that says that's slowly starting to come back online. But so too was there a headline in the US that says now Union Pacific is shutting down its train service from the West Coast into the rest of the U.S. So there are, just every day, there's more and more of these throttles being enacted on our supply chains and on our food production. And it's the food production I want to talk about today, because for more than a year now, I've been talking about the losses to soybeans and corn that have been creating this global grains crisis. And wheat has been the one thing that's been the runner-up. There's still been wheat ending stocks in a lot of the world. Here's a list, before we get started here, of the top wheat exporting countries. Lots of production. These are the ones that produce it and export it to feed the rest of the world. And we'll go down the list here. Russia, US, Canada, France, Ukraine, Australia, Argentina, Germany, Kazakhstan, and get a sense. Those represent the bulk of the wheat that's available for purchase in the rest of the world. And now let's look at some headlines that affect each of those producers. Drought and heat. Of course, this is based on the USDA's data yesterday that was released on Monday that said that the U.S. crop, as you can see here, is quite literally off the charts bad. Historically bad. Hasn't been this poor since 1988. According to the USDA, 63% of the crop is rated poor to very poor. So that's why the markets spiked up to 2.5-month highs yesterday. Quote, unwelcome, indeed, dry weather in key U.S., Canadian, and Russia wheat growing areas is causing pressure on bullish for wheat prices. So let's take a look at that. Chicago wheat futures gained on Monday, climbing to 2.5-month highs, supported by dry weather in parts of the U.S., Canadian, and Russia growing areas, raising global supply worries for wheat. Okay, this isn't Christian at the Ice Age Farmer. This is NASDAQ.com telling you that we have global wheat supply worries. Again, why is that? It's because it's not just the U.S. crop that's in this record terrible condition. It's also Canada, obviously, right? North America is being crushed by this drought right now. Here from UPI, farmers in Canada report massive crop damage in the heat wave. Now, this article goes on to say that fruit was baking on the trees, berries were burnt to a crisp. Some people have reported to me that this seemed like a very unnatural kind of heat wave, almost as if the fruit were being microwaved on the trees. Far be it from me to speculate. It suffice to say, though, that the crops are definitely damaged, including wheat. Here's a summary of how quickly the condition of the Saskatchewan wheat crop and canola crop has dropped off in the last 3-4 weeks here, from 77 good to excellent on wheat and 64% canola, down to 25, a quarter of it of wheat, and 18% of canola good to excellent, meaning it's all deteriorated rapidly. The same is true in Alberta, going from 84% good to excellent for wheat and 80% canola, down to 39% for spring wheat and 33% for canola. So the crops there really plummeting in terms of their condition.
What we've seen in the news a lot recently, are basically fires that are taking places in factories. 2020, we saw some supply chain disruptions, and it was actually listed, hindsight mind you, that the number one cause of the supply chain problems in 2020 was factory fires. Isn't that interesting? Especially for the fact, if you look at it, that, man, with the amount of high-tech ways to stop fires, prevent fires, alarm for fires, and sprinkler systems and everything, there's been no better time than the present to thwart fires, especially in a factory. That's the top reason for the supply chain problem in 2020. 2021 actually sees it as the most fire factories recorded ever in a single year. So we're actually seeing records in both of those years. Of course, now we're in 2022. And are we seeing factory fires again? Yeah, absolutely. And now, I'm sure you probably heard of it, Azure Standard, which is near and dear to our heart. Their headquarters burned down to the ground. And we're not even talking about necessarily a factory fire here, but their headquarters, we're talking about an office building, And of course, it may not be for a long time before they figure out what caused that fire in the first place, but in my mind is, how in the world could that have happened? How could there have been a fire in an office building, again, with all the high-tech suppression equipment to stop that fire in the first place? It boggles my mind. I'm not a firefighter. I'm sure the people who investigate this know this far more than I do. In fact, maybe you actually know more about this as well. But when we see record numbers of factory fires taking place for a couple of years, and now in 2022 we're actually off to a very rocky start with some pretty catastrophic fires, I have to wonder, sabotage. That's what pops in my mind, because when we talk about trusting people, trusting the government, and all these things that are happening, especially for the fact that we're held in the dark so much, it's hard to not think of sabotage in those situations and wonder if there's something more sinister behind this. And I'll be honest with you, I want your opinion about this, because I'm sure as far as research goes, you may have actually seen a lot more than I have as far as read what's actually causing these problems. But when you look at the Walmart fire here and the Azure Standard fire here, which, Azure Standard, by the way, is the nation's premier for organic and healthy foods. It's not some small company. And we're looking at the chip factory here. I could easily see it where alone you could brush them off. In fact, I'm sure for like the ASML fire, most of you probably never even heard of that company before. Or maybe the Walmart fire was a fleeting glance in the news. When you see these separately, you may think, oh, well, it just happens. Fires and such happens. Which that is true. They do. But cumulatively, absolutely may not just be sabotage, may actually constitute some type of economic false flag. Think about that. And that's what this whole video is basically about, is how we're seeing all these things taking place already in a national emergency. We're already having a chip shortage. We're already having problems in the food supply chain, problems in the food supply chain. And then on top of that, we see fires in those specific areas. Isn't that interesting? And so I think of a false flag simply something that could be, and I really stress the word could be set up by our government to cause simply more of a national emergency. Because in my mind, when I've seen things that actually exacerbate national emergencies, I usually find it has something to do with power, and the politicians want the power, and therefore will cause these catastrophic things to happen so they can stay in power, or actually even have more power as we change over the laws to allow to investigate these and therefore thwart more of our freedom.
Because looking at the record pricing now with nitrogen, this is coming off TradingView. Vertical. And we've seen vertical again, and off the Economic Collapse blog. This is April 10th. Price of nitrogen, 200 to 1,000. That's a 5x increase. Potassium's gone 200 to 700, and phosphorus has gone 250 to 700. So a lot of farmers and people are starting to blend their own. They're going to get nitrogen at 4500, just pure nitrogen. Like when you open a bag of mix, it's got those different colored granules in there. That's because the potassium is a different color from the phosphorus, is a different color from the nitrogen. So when you look in there, you got 3 different colored pellets. Well, they mixed it themselves to get that ratio of 10-10-10 or 6-12-12 or whatever you want to do. Things are changing out on the farm for sure. A lot of people are playing chemistry set suddenly because these, what were considered staples, are no longer available. So mixing and matching is where we're going. Now the shipping is an integral part of all of this. And then we look at the containers still locked down. It's going to be a year delay at least getting everything back up from Shanghai, Ningbo, Hangzhou, and Suzhou ports. And the number here looks exactly like the fertilizer prices and the prices for all farm inputs. It's following the same. Everything is going vertical like this. Everything. How long will that bottleneck take to sort itself out? And this is just an average density map that you can find across the net of ships waiting at anchor to unload their cargo. Now the outbound cargo as well is going to be affected. So no machinery repair parts, this sort of thing is going to really bottleneck a lot of ag here too. So those types of shipping delays coming out of China. What about our repair parts for anything agricultural? Machinery repair parts are not coming in. So pretty much what we have is what we have. Like I said in my last video, it's almost like we're under siege, like the country is being cut off. Whether you siege a castle in the 1500s, you cut off all supplies, logistics, food imports. anything available to keep the people functioning at an optimum level, you cut that off to minimal or below minimal, and eventually they capitulate. So if there's no repair parts coming out of China and we can't repair our tractors or combines, harvesters, whatever it is, sprayers, nozzles, whatever it is to get implements into and onto the crops or out of the fields to the grain silos, then what? You got $1 million machine sitting in the field because it lost a tire and they don't have a rim for it and they're waiting for it to come to China. So you got $1 million piece of equipment just sitting idle because they can't get repair parts for it. This is where we're at today. And we haven't even gone through the planting or the harvesting yet. So I can't see it getting any better because that red line vertical means we're literally cut off from all repair parts coming in for our farm implements right now.
That one was actually, if you want to call it peaceful, that's quote unquote peaceful. But here, you start to see the people rebel against the authorities here. So hungry residents in Shanghai break out from their compound. I mentioned that to you a while back, that there's compounds of apartment buildings that have common areas. They're basically blocked off by the CCP. And you have here, people breaking through. And I think this has been going on around 6 to 7 weeks. So, people really haven't been able to visit grocery stores for that long. They're even saying, it's not even a class issue. There's rich people and poor people that just aren't able to be getting food delivered. And so they're reaching their breaking point. And these are some interesting videos as well. And so they're saying that because of the lockdowns, the Chinese government is obstructing food trucks from getting into Shanghai. So there's these images of lots and lots of trucks that are backed up. Again, the entire economy shut down. I forget how many billions of dollars they're losing per month, and really how this is going to affect the global supply chains even worse. But that clip is interesting, as well as this. Let me just back it up here. The quarantined people are starving, but because of the logistics, right, you can't have enough people, delivery services, to get all the food out to everyone. And so because of the logistics bottleneck, you've got all this food spoiling. Crazy footages here. And as I said, in relation to the global rebellion that's brewing and the toppling of governments, again, this is everything that we're going to see is going to be blamed on government and this move to overthrow world governments, whether it's the pandemic and everything that they've put people through with that, the food shortages, it's going to be blamed on government. Climate change is blamed on government and man, in part. On the left side, people will say it's because of fossil fuels and it's man's fault. But then you're starting to hear people talk about weapons, climate weapons, and weather modification. So it's going to be man's fault. So again, a lot of these things, and people, instead of people coming to repentance and seeking God, instead it will be blamed on man. People are going to put the blinders up and not really see God in this picture. There's going to be a scapegoat for all of people's hatred to be poured out onto.
The year 1933. The place, the Soviet Union. Behind the facade, food is being used as a weapon against peoples who have proven troublesome to Moscow. Famine is engineered deliberately in the North Caucasus, the Volga Basin, and Ukraine. The Soviet secret police seal off Ukraine's borders. No one can get out or bring food in. A nation the size of France is strangled by hunger. In less than 2 years, 10 million people die. 7 million of them in Ukraine. 3 million of them children. The wheat is left standing in the fields. The demoralized farmers respond to the ruinous taxes and the presence of troops by simply refusing to work. The grain quotas or taxes are deliberately raised to exceed what the individual farmers can possibly produce. Either they join the collectives where the taxes are 3 times lower or face exile as kulaks. By mid-1932, 3/4 of all Ukrainian farms are collectivized. Then, in August, crippling new quotas are levied on the collectives themselves. Another exorbitant quota is levied in October, and yet another at the beginning of the new year. These levies are impossible to meet. The regime blames the farmers for the stringent food rationing in the cities. In reality, the Soviets are dumping tons of wheat on Western markets. The 1932 harvest yields enough grain to have fed the entire population of Ukraine for 2 years. Instead, famine ravages the country.
We survived thanks to parishioners, the railroad employees, who had the chance to travel beyond the borders of Ukraine. And we had neighbors, Soviet officials. They always had food. We came through their garbage cans. We eat rotten potatoes, rotten cabbage and beets, and the scraps of food which they threw away. I am not ashamed to admit it, because it was a matter of survival. I didn't want to die.
Spring 1933. The man-made famine reaches its height. 25,000 are dying every day. 1,000 an hour. 17 human beings every minute.
After this, I looked, and behold, a door was opened in heaven. And the first voice which I heard was as it were of a trumpet talking with me, which said, Come up hither, and I will show thee things which must be hereafter. And immediately I was in the Spirit. And behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. And I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and I heard, as it were the noise of thunder, one of the 4 beasts saying, Come and see. And I saw, and behold, a white horse, and he that sat on him had a bow, and a crown was given unto him, and he went forth, conquering and to conquer. And when he had opened the 2nd seal, I heard the 2nd beast say, Come and see. And when he had opened the 3rd seal, I heard the 3rd beast say, Come and see. And I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on him had a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 beasts say, A measure of wheat for a penny, and 3 measures of barley for a penny, and see thou hurt not the oil and the wine. And when he had opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th beast say, Come and see. And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat on him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the 4th part of the earth to kill with sword, and with hunger, and with death, and with the beasts of the earth.
So I'm going to show you the seals and the trumpets. I apologize for the robot voice, but I'm going to play this first section of my Revelation video, and then we'll explain what it means. and what it means to us in the future. Because, as I said, it's all repeat patterns. It had a meaning to the people that lived then, and it's going to have a meaning to us now, because we're living through it now.
The apocalypse employs chiastic structures and recursive hierarchical patterns. Although similar themes are repeated in the 7 seals, in the 7 trumpets and in the 7 vials, they are not the same. They herald an intensification of divine judgments. These patterns do not describe the continuous ebb and flow of history, but rather the inbreaking of the day of the Lord at critical moments. The patterns describe the inbreaking of divine sovereignty in history. Like a pebble breaking the surface of a pond and creating ripples, echoes and reverberations across time and space, they interrupt the continuum and remind humanity that God is in control. The apocalypse means uncovering or revelation. What God reveals is a new heaven and a new earth. The apocalypse was first given to Jewish Christians in the 1st century, and the symbols, imagery, and patterns are Jewish themes from the Old Testament. The seals describe a period that begins at Passover and ends with the destruction of the temple and with Masada 42 years later on the day after Passover. What began at the cross with a slain lamb, ends 42 years later with the wrath of the Lamb, followed by 21 years of silence.
It started with the stoning of Stephen, the first martyr. Simply for preaching the gospel, Stephen was dragged outside the city walls of Jerusalem and pelted to death. The book of Hebrews describes the suffering of those that followed in the ensuing years. But others were tortured, refusing to turn from God in order to be set free. They placed their hope in a better life after the resurrection. Some were jeered at and their backs were cut open with whips. Others were chained in prisons. Some died by stoning, some were sawed in half, and others were killed with the sword. Some went about wearing skins of sheep and goats, destitute and oppressed and mistreated. They were too good for this world, wandering over deserts and mountains, hiding in caves and holes in the ground. This description of Christian suffering was written around 68 AD, just a few years after Emperor Nero had taken to the throne of the Roman Empire. Nero's hatred for Christians has become infamous, but the persecution that he inflicted on them actually started in relatively minor ways. It began with confiscation of property and vandalization of homes. Occasionally there were prison sentences. Gradually the antipathy grew, and his violence towards them became ever more savage. The horrific Colosseum shows were established, where Christians were put to death in front of a baying stadium for sport. They were sewn up inside of the skins of wild animals and then set upon by dogs who would shred them to death. They were tied to poles in arenas of lions. Nero seemed to take great pleasure in inventing new ways of ending Christian lives. Perhaps one of the most gruesome methods was by tying them to poles in his garden, covering them in wax or oil, and then setting them alight to become living human torches to illuminate the night.
Then Jesus said to his disciples, "If any of you wants to be my follower, you must turn from your selfish ways, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake, you will save it." For 2,000 years, these words of warning have proven to be well-founded.
On the Mount of Olives, Jesus' disciples asked him what signs there would be to signal his return and the end of the world. Jesus' response has become known as the Olivet Discourse. This is how Matthew records it. As Jesus was leaving the temple grounds, his disciples pointed out to him the various temple buildings. But he responded, "Do you see all these buildings? I tell you the truth, they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another." Later, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives. His disciples came to him privately and said, "Tell us, when will all this happen? What sign will signal your return and the end of the world?" Jesus told them, Don't let anyone mislead you, for many will come in my name, claiming, I am the Messiah. They will deceive many, and you will hear of wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in many parts of the world, but all this is only the first of the birth pains, with more to come. Then you will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. You will be hated all over the world because you are my followers, and many will turn away from me and betray and hate each other. Jesus then says that there will be an increase of war and threats of war. The geopolitical landscape will become increasingly tumultuous. There will be also an increase in famines and natural disasters. Jesus describes all these problems as birth pains. The significance of this metaphor is that birth pains increase in intensity and frequency as time rolls on. This is how it will be with all these things. Next, Jesus says, then you will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. You will be hated all over the world because you are my followers, and many will turn away from me and betray and hate each other. How will this be a specific sign of the end? After all, if persecution has been normal throughout all history, it can hardly be considered a sign just because it's still happening at the end of time. However, the specific sign that Jesus is telling us about is that it will get noticeably worse. The birth pains metaphor applies once more. In fact, this is almost certainly describing a kind of end-time genocide. So bad will it be that many Christians will buckle under the pressure and for the sake of comfort denounce their faith and join the crowd. Many Christians will even find themselves betrayed by those who should have been their friends and partners in the gospel.
Chapter 5. And I saw in the right hand of him that sat on the throne a book, written within, and on the backside, sealed with 7 seals. And I saw a strong angel proclaiming with a loud voice, Who is worthy to open the book and to loose the seals thereof? And no man in heaven nor in earth, neither under the earth, was able to open the book, neither to look thereon. And I wept much, because no man was found worthy to open and to read the book, neither to look thereon. And I beheld, and lo, in the midst of the throne and of the 4 beasts, and in the midst of the elders, stood a lamb, as it had been slain, having 7 horns and 7 eyes, which are the 7 spirits of God sent forth into all the earth. And he came and took the book out of the right hand of him that sat upon the throne. And when he had taken the book, the 4 beasts and 24 elders fell down before the Lamb, having every one of them harps and golden vials full of odours, which are the prayers of saints. And they sung a new song, saying, Thou art worthy to take the book, and to open the seals thereof. For thou wast slain, and hast redeemed us to God by thy blood, out of every kindred and tongue and people and nation, and hast made us unto our God kings and priests, and we shall reign on the earth.
Then as I looked, I saw a door standing open in heaven, and the same voice I had heard before spoke to me like a trumpet blast. The voice said, Come up here, and I will show you what must happen after this. And instantly I was in the Spirit. John looks at the throne of God in heaven and sees that he is holding a scroll. Then I saw a scroll in the right hand of the one who was sitting on the throne. There was writing on the inside and the outside of the scroll, and it was sealed with 7 seals. Just like in Ezekiel's day, the scroll contains pronouncements of woe and doom. However, this time it's not just for Israel, it's for the whole earth. Indeed, written on this scroll are God's orders for the end of human history as we know it. The whole world is about to be judged. Unlike Ezekiel's scroll, which was unrolled before him, this scroll is sealed shut with 7 seals. In the 1st century, it was extremely common practice for important documents to be written on scrolls and to be sealed shut with wax or clay in this way. Only a qualified person would be authorized to break the seals and read what was written within. Unfortunately, in this case, it appears as though nobody has such authority. And I saw a strong angel who shouted with a loud voice, Who is worthy to break the seals on the scroll and open it? but no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll and read it. If the scroll can't be opened and the words within read, God's final judgment on wickedness and godlessness can't be proclaimed or enacted. This means that evil will continue unabated forever. Satan will remain the prince of the world. There will be no justice. All the murders, rapes, idolatry, thefts, genocides, lies, backstabbing, blasphemies, and all the wickedness that this world has ever known can't be dealt with. The end can never come. It looks very much like the world has no hope of ever being put right. Will there be no justice? John weeps out of frustration. Then I began to weep bitterly because no one was found worthy to open the scroll and read it. However, all hope is not lost. John looks around for a lion, but instead he sees a lamb entering the throne room. Then I saw a lamb that looked as if it had been slaughtered, but it was now standing between the throne and the 4 living beings and among the 24 elders. He had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which represent the 7-fold Spirit of God that is sent out into every part of the earth. He stepped forward and took the scroll from the right hand of the one sitting on the throne. This lamb that looks as though it has been slaughtered but yet lives, of course represents Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. Jesus is the heir to David's throne. Jesus is the Lamb of God who was slain for the sins of the world and yet rose from the dead. Jesus is all those things. And Jesus is the only one who is qualified to judge the earth, because he's the only one who walked on it, faced sin and was tempted as men are tempted, faced the same pressures that men face and yet conquered it. In his perfect life, death and resurrection, in his victory, he has won the authority to judge us. He has felt the pain that we feel, experienced the loneliness that we experience, faced the same temptations that we face, and yet remained sinless. It tells us a great deal about the fairness of God, that we can only rightly be judged by someone who has walked in our shoes. Indeed, while people instinctively believe that Father God will judge them, the Bible tells us in several places that God has delegated this responsibility to his Son, Jesus. Jesus said, "The Father judges no one. Instead, he has given the Son absolute authority to judge, so that everyone will honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Anyone who does not honor the Son is certainly not honoring the Father who sent him."
Now this is what I call the global village. You no longer have to be anywhere in order to do everything.
The same information is available at the same moment from every part of the world.
The world is now like a continually sounding tribal drum, where everybody gets the message all the time. A princess gets married in England, and boom, boom, boom go the drums. We all hear about it. An earthquake in North Africa, a Hollywood star gets drunk, away go the drums again.
Electric media retrieve the forest, stirring all around you.
Electric information comes from all directions at once, and when information comes from all directions simultaneously, you are living in an acoustic world. The acoustic world has no continuity, no homogeneity, no connections, and no stasis. Everything is changing. Pattern recognition in the midst of a huge, overwhelming, destructive force is the way out of the maelstrom.
This is how Revelation is structured. You've got 7 seals broken in order. The 7th one unlocks 7 trumpets. The first 4 are blown at the same time. Then 5, 6, 7. That unlocks 7 vials of wrath. Here's what the symbolism of the seals, trumpets, and vials in Revelation refer to. Seals represent controversial mysteries. That's why they're sealed up. Trumpets represent blatant warnings. That's why it's a trumpet. 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are never called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. They just show up in order. They're riders riding different colored horses. White, red, black. And this one's usually translated pale, but the word chloros actually means green. The 4th one is more mysterious. We're going to get into that because that's actually a current day thing. The rise of the green priesthood that is about population reduction and earth worship. We're going to explain that next. So the 4th horseman is green. Chloros means green. You can look that up yourself. That's a Greek word. The word chlorine comes from that word because chlorine is bright green if it's in a super concentrated form. You can Google that too. 3 other times the word chloros is used in the New Testament. Each time it's for something very clearly green, like grass and trees. So that is written, the rider is called Death, and he can kill 1/4 of the world population.
When the 4th seal is opened, the last cherubim calls forth a pale green horse, an image that represents death. Thankfully, I've never seen a dead body in the flesh, but I'm told that this is the colour that corpses turn. In other words, as a result of all this war, economic troubles, famine, diseases, and natural disasters, death will inevitably follow hard on the heels of all those things. Now, when it says these 2 were given authority over 1/4 of the earth, this is often interpreted as 1/4 of the planet's population will die. It may not mean that. It could just mean, and I think this is the more likely explanation, that 1/4 of the Earth's geographical area is going to be particularly badly affected, like the Middle East, for example. Now that we've looked at the first 4 seals, it might be useful if we put them side by side with the Olivet Discourse. By doing so, we'll discover that they mirror each other almost exactly. The third thing that Jesus talks about on the Mount of Olives is famines and earthquakes all over the world. So when we turn to the 3rd seal, we read about a black horseman who causes economic crises and famine in the world. The 4th thing that Jesus talked about in the Olivet Discourse was persecution, suffering, and death for following him. And again, when we turn to the 4th seal, we read about a pale green horseman representing death and the grave. There seems to be quite a clear correlation between the 2 passages, and if it's a valid comparison to make, we should also note that around the 3rd seal, marked by economic collapse and famine, Jesus tells us there will be an increase in natural disasters.
Now I want to go on from this brief overview of the churches to chapter 4. Ruth and I read chapter 4 together this morning, as we usually read a passage. And I was so overcome with the glory of it, I broke into tears. I couldn't read. And I've discovered one of the problems of wearing glasses, which I do reluctantly, is that when you shed tears, you smear your glasses. From time to time, I have to pass them to Ruth to clean them up for me, but I'm all right at the moment. Now we go on to chapter 5, which is where the scroll, that is really the book of Revelation, is presented. And it was sealed, as you know, with 7 seals. In those days, they didn't have printed books, but they had long sheets of paper or parchment that were rolled up. And every book was originally a scroll. And this chapter opens with an angel crying with a loud voice, a very strong angel. And he says, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and to undo its 7 seals?" And no one was found worthy in all of heaven. And I'm doing what John did. I'm weeping that no one was found worthy to open this scroll. I believe the scroll is God's plan to close the age. But one of the elders said to John, "Don't weep. The Lion of the tribe of Judah has prevailed." I want to point out to you that when Jesus became a Jew, it was not just for 33 years. Because here he is in eternity. He's still the Lion of the tribe of Judah. And Judah, you know, is the name from which we get the word Jew. It's directly derived from Judah. I often think that heaven will be an embarrassing place for anti-Semites. If you think about the New Jerusalem, it had 12 foundations and 12 doors, and every name was a Jewish name. Furthermore, the name above all other names was Yeshua. So how can you feel if you're opposed to the Jewish people? How could you ever feel at home in the New Jerusalem? Now we come to chapter 6. And I will simply give you the Prince version. You don't have to believe it, but I believe that God has made this real to me. First of all, there are the 4 horsemen. We read about each of them. The third horse, in verses 5 and 6, when he opened the third seal, I heard the third living creature say, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales or balances in his hand. And I heard a voice in the midst of the 4 living creatures saying, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil and the wine." Now this black horse to me is a very obvious picture of shortage and rationing. And denarius was a working man's daily wage. So a working man at that time would get just enough money to feed himself. And then it says, "Do not hurt the oil and the wine." This is my personal understanding. The oil and the wine were reserved for the rich. And in the midst of the shortage, there were those who were living in luxury. Now we come to the 4th horse. When he opened the 4th seal, I heard the voice of the 4th living creature saying, "Come." And I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and the name of him who sat on it was Death, and Hades followed with him. And authority was given to them over 1/4 of the earth, to kill with sword, with hunger, with death, and by the beasts of the earth. Now that's an obvious picture of famine and ensuing widespread death. And it says actually it would affect the 1/4 part of the earth. There were 2 horses. The name of the rider on the first was Death. The second was Hades. Death claims the bodies of men. Hades claims the souls of men. And notice authority was given to them. Where did the authority come? From God, from the throne. Now, as I meditate on those 4 horses, there is one conviction that becomes stronger and stronger in me. And it's a message for God's people. The message is this: the white horse has to stay ahead of the other 3 horses. We have to get there with the offer of mercy through the gospel before these terrible judgments fall on people. And I think I can say that Ruth and I are motivated by a passion to see that white horse get there on time. We've been privileged to see it happen in some places. We were in Yugoslavia, as Mahesh also was, before this trouble broke out. And we reached a number of people, and my main books have been translated into Serbo-Croatian and are available there right now. I'm glad we didn't leave it too late. This past May, we were in Moscow, held a conference for 1,000 leaders of the church, all of whom had been contacted previously through either through my radio program in Russia or my books translated. And at the end, one experienced leader who worked in Russia said, I've organized many conferences, but this was the best that I've ever organized. And he said, I think it came at a vital moment, because the cost of travel is going up so much that people will no longer be able to come that distance. Some of them had traveled 6 days by train to get to that conference. And I would like to say, nowhere have I ever seen greater enthusiasm than in those young Russian people. Ruth and I have a tape. It's not a professional tape. It's just of some of the worship in Russian. We don't really understand Russian. But when we need encouragement, we just put on that tape. Oh, to meet people who are hungry, who are thirsty, who've never heard, who don't know. Brothers and sisters, you're missing a lot if you don't get involved in reaching the unreached. You can sit here in a comfortable church and have a wonderful time, but the real rewards of the people whose heart is with those who've never heard. And so that's our ambition, to ride with that white horse before the other horses get there. So you can understand, when I begin to talk about the white horse, I get inspired. That's so vivid to me. And I see the other horses, the red horses, has advanced a long way. And in some places the black horse is there, in some places the pale horse. People are dying of famine. Somalia, parts of Yugoslavia, other places. Brothers and sisters, what are you doing about it?